The Romans brushed their teeth with human urine. Victorians posed with their dead. Entire cities refused to bathe, believing water itself brought death. These aren't myths. They're the shadows of our past, proof that civilization was built not just on stone and steel, but on blood, fear, and madness. History isn't just a story of kings and empires. It's a graveyard of secrets, buried beneath the gold, the crowns, and the lies. When you think of the mighty Roman Empire, you probably imagine marble palaces, grand baths, and men in gleaming armor. But hygiene in ancient Rome wasn't nearly as glamorous as we like to think. In fact, one of their strangest and most disturbing customs involved human urine. Yes, you heard that right. Romans actually used urine as a mouthwash. Across the empire, large public urinals were built where citizens relieved themselves. But the waste wasn't simply discarded. It was collected in massive clay jars, left to ferment, and then sold by merchants as a household product. Why? Because urine contains ammonia, a natural cleaning agent. To the Romans, this was science. To us, it's revolting. Wealthy citizens believed gargling with urine whitened their teeth and freshened their breath. Some even rubbed it on their clothes as a form of bleach, and it wasn't a rare practice. Poets like Catullus even mocked others for their urine-bright smiles, proving it was widely known and accepted. To them, it was fashionable. To us, it's horrifying. So the next time you hear about the sophistication of Rome, remember this. Behind the marble statues and golden crowns, some of the brightest smiles were born from the darkest, foulest source imaginable. In the 18th and 19th centuries, medical science was advancing, but it faced one major problem: bodies. Medical schools needed cadavers for study and dissection, yet the law allowed only the corpses of executed criminals to be used. Demand quickly outstripped supply. That's when the resurrection men stepped in. By night, these body snatchers prowled graveyards with shovels and sacks. Freshly buried coffins were their targets. The soil was still soft, making it easier to dig. Within hours of burial, the dead were pulled from their resting places, stripped of clothing, and hauled through the darkness to be sold for cash. Doctors rarely asked questions. Families soon realized graves were being disturbed. Iron cages, called mort safes, were built over graves. Watchtowers were erected in cemeteries. Some families even hired guards or set spring-loaded traps to deter thieves. But the robbers were relentless. To them, the dead were nothing more than currency. And for grieving families, the thought of their loved ones being stolen, dissected and discarded was a second nightmare, worse than death itself. In the end, grave robbing only declined when laws finally changed, allowing unclaimed bodies from hospitals and workhouses to be used for study. Until then, the line between science and crime was crossed night after night in the silence of moonlit cemeteries. The guillotine was designed in 1792 as the ultimate tool of mercy, a quick, painless death for those condemned. One clean strike, and it would all be over in an instant, or so people believed. But history whispers something far more disturbing. Eyewitnesses began reporting that death under the guillotine wasn't always so immediate. Severed heads sometimes showed signs of life, brief, terrifying flickers of consciousness. One of the most chilling stories comes from an executioner himself. After a man's head dropped into the basket, the executioner lifted it up and, almost mockingly, slapped the cheek. To his horror, the eyes snapped open and glared back at him, burning with unmistakable rage. The crowd gasped, some even fainted, as the truth set in. Consciousness doesn't vanish the instant the blade falls. Modern science suggests they may have been right. A severed head can remain aware for up to 10 horrifying seconds, long enough to hear the roar of the crowd, see your own body collapse, and even realize you've been separated from it forever. Imagine the terror. Your mind awake, trapped in a head with no body, the last thing you see being the faces of strangers staring back in shock. The guillotine may have ended a life quickly, but it also delivered one of the most nightmarish deaths in human history. In medieval Europe, one of the most feared punishments was the breaking wheel, a method of execution designed not only to kill, but to break a person in every possible sense. The condemned was tied, spread-eagle, to a massive wooden wheel, their limbs stretched tight. Then came the hammer. Blow after blow, the executioner shattered the victim's arms, legs, and ribs, carefully avoiding vital organs so that death would not come quickly. The body was twisted unnaturally, bones jutting out beneath the skin, as the wheel itself was sometimes spun so that the crowd could see every broken angle. The agony could last for hours, sometimes days. When the executioner was finally finished, the shattered body was left on display, perched high on a post with the wheel itself. Under the blazing sun, crows and wild dogs feasted while villagers passed by, reminded of the price of disobedience. This wasn't justice, it was theater, a performance of fear meant to keep the people obedient, terrified of sharing the same fate. For the condemned, the breaking wheel was more than execution. It was public humiliation, slow torture, and a death that turned the human body into a spectacle of suffering. The Black Death of the 14th century was one of the deadliest plagues in human history, wiping out nearly half of Europe's population. But beyond the sickness itself, the fear, the superstition, and the misguided attempts at survival made the horror even worse. In those years, people didn't understand germs or how diseases spread. Instead, they clung to terrifying beliefs, and one of the strangest was this: bathing could kill you. Doctors of the time warned that hot water opened the pores, leaving the body vulnerable to poisoned air. So, instead of washing away filth, people avoided water at all costs. For months, even years, men and women wore the same clothing until it rotted against their skin. Their bodies were caked in grime. Some smeared themselves with ashes or mud, believing dirt formed a protective barrier against the plague. Others carried pungent herbs, onions, or vinegar-soaked cloths, convinced that foul smells could drive away death. The most desperate resorted to darker rituals. Some wore the carcasses of dead animals around their necks, hoping the stench would confuse the sickness. Others rubbed themselves with blood or pressed charms of bone and iron against their skin. In fact, their filth and fear only fed the plague, allowing fleas and rats, the true carriers, to thrive. The Black Death wasn't just a disease of the body, it was a disease of the mind, and superstition made it unstoppable. Trepanation is one of the oldest and most horrifying medical practices in human history. Traces of it have been found in skulls thousands of years old across nearly every continent. But what exactly was it? Healers believed that mental illness, seizures, or even persistent headaches were caused by evil spirits trapped inside the head. Their solution was as brutal as it was primitive, drilling a hole directly into the skull to release whatever darkness lurked within. There was no anesthesia, no sterile tools. Patients were pinned down, screaming as sharpened stones, bones, or crude metal instruments ground slowly against their skulls. The sound of bone cracking and splintering filled the air, while blood poured freely down their faces. Many bled out on the spot, or succumbed to infection days later. What's even more chilling is that archaeological evidence shows signs of healing on some skulls, meaning patients sometimes lived for years after the procedure, carrying a permanent hole in their head as a reminder of their ordeal. And this wasn't an isolated practice. From ancient South America to Africa, Europe, and Asia, trepanation was performed for centuries. Different cultures, separated by oceans, all shared the same belief, that salvation could be found by cutting into the very seat of the human soul, the brain. For them, it was medicine. For us, it is a glimpse into one of the darkest chapters of medical history. The Victorian era is remembered for its elegance, its etiquette, and its obsession with appearances. But hidden beneath the polished manners and lace gowns was a morbid fascination with death itself. When a loved one passed away, families didn't always say goodbye in silence. Instead, they often brought in a photographer to capture one final portrait. These weren't simple images of the deceased laid to rest. What made them unsettling is how the dead were made to appear alive. Children were carefully dressed, placed in chairs with their favorite toys, their bodies stiff, but posed as if they were simply playing. Mothers were arranged to look as though they were peacefully resting, heads tilted slightly to the side. Fathers were propped upright, their lifeless frames supported by hidden stands. And in some cases, their eyes, cold and lifeless, were painted open afterward on the photograph itself, creating the haunting illusion of a gaze. Families would often stand beside them, dressed in their best clothes, staring into the camera. To them, this was a cherished keepsake, a way of preserving the memory of the dead. To us today, these photographs are chilling, because it's hard to tell at first glance who is alive and who is not. These portraits were called memento mori, reminders of mortality. For Victorians, they were tokens of love. For modern eyes, they are haunting relics, frozen in time, where the living and the dead shared one final silent moment together.